Hello, and welcome once again to Book 2, Chapter 10 of You Should Be Reading. Today we're going to be talking about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Now this is quite an old book. It's got several different releases, I believe, over the years, and there's been a movie, there's been a prequel movie recently, there's been a musical based off the life of the Wicked Witch of the West called Wicked, a series of books that musical was based off. There's a lot going on, but this is the original. The very first story that L. Frank Baum wrote set in the land of Oz. And I'd never read it until recently. It's one of those old classic tales that just never really got into my attention until just recently when I decided to pick it up. I was actually down in the States when I picked this up. This is the Barnes & Noble Classics edition. I was down visiting friends and I picked up both this one and the omnibus edition containing the next three. I haven't gotten around to reading those yet, but I will. So for those of you who don't know what The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is about, it is about a young girl named Dorothy who is growing up in Kansas during, I believe it's around the area of the 1920s, the Great Depression. And she's living with her aunt and her uncle because her parents have passed away. Now, at some point in her youth, a tornado comes through, picks up the house, and drops it in the land of Oz, where it crushes an evil witch, and she goes on a magical adventure, meeting a scarecrow made out of straw, man who has no brains, the tin woodsman, man made out of tin, he has no heart, the cowardly lion, who's this big ferocious beast who's actually a coward at heart, the Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch, the Munchkins, the Winkies, the Flying Monkeys, all of that is in here. Now, there are definitely some differences between this and the original movie with Judy Garland. Naturally, Judy Garland was quite a bit older in the movie. I believe they placed her about 15 or 16 is the age of Dorothy in the movie. Reading the book and seeing the illustrations and whatnot that go with it, it's more likely that young Dorothy is probably about 6, maybe 8. She is a very young child when this happens to her, according to the way this reads. There's a lot of stuff in this that happened that never made it into the movies. A lot of little things. The chapters are very short. This was a super quick read. The book, it looks thick, but yes. Let me just do a quick look. Yeah, basically, this part here is the actual story. There's endnotes. There's a big, huge introduction. But this is the actual story. And there's all kinds of weird things that happen in there. Some other things. The shoes that Dorothy has in here, she gets from the Wicked Witch of the East, are silver, not ruby. There's a special enchantment on them. There's other little magical items that kick up here and there. Other interesting things that pop up. I don't want to spoil some of it for those of you who haven't read, because you should. It is a very interesting children's story. Definitely for children, too. This is not the kind of story that a lot of adults would... I don't want to say that a lot of adults wouldn't enjoy it, because there's probably some that would. But on average, I think this is the type of story that most adults would enjoy reading to their children or to the children of others. Just reading to smaller people, because of the way the setup is. It's very much aimed, the writing is very much aimed towards children. And this goes back to something I said in the first series about my first book, I should say, that The Cat in the Hat is a good book, I said, even though it's definitely aimed for children. It's still a good book. This Wonderful Wizard of Oz, still a good book, even though it's aimed at children. I enjoyed it for what it was, and I took some other enjoyment out of it as well, because this is a valuable piece of American culture, but also human culture. This L. Frank Baum's Wonderful Wizard of Oz, I would put this up against such similar works as the works of Charles Dickens, the works of William Shakespeare, other very famous authors, even in our day and age. J.K. Rowling, I would put this right up in here with the Harry Potter books, which I've read. So it's very interesting, very quick. Chapters are all very small. The danger that's presented, because there are dangers and obstacles and monsters and stuff that happen, it's not really, it doesn't come across as being too terribly threatening. It's all they're journeying along, an obstacle, a danger comes up, it gets handled by one of her companions or her in a variety of ways, and they move on. It's meant to be kind of bedtime reading, really and truly. So the writing style lends itself well to what you imagine. Uh, Speaking of which, there's also, I cannot remember the exact name of it. You can probably find it if you look it up. Go to the IMDb page for John Ritter. May God rest his soul. That particular actor ended up playing in a made-for-TV miniseries all about L. Frank Baum and his writing of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And I caught bits and pieces of it when it was airing, and it looked to be a phenomenal show. So if you're interested about that, go and check that out as well. But for now, I'm going to leave you with Chapter 1 of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 1, The Cyclone. Dorothy lived in the midst of the great Kansas prairies, with Uncle Henry, who was a farmer, and Aunt Em, who was the farmer's wife. Their house was small, for the lumber to build it had to be carried by wagon many miles. There were 4 walls, a floor, and a roof, which made one room, and this room contained a rusty-looking cooking stove, a cupboard for the dishes, a table, 3 or 4 chairs, and the beds. Uncle Henry and Aunt Em had a big bed in one corner, and Dorothy had a little bed in another corner. There was no garret at all, no cellar, except a small hole dug in the ground, called a cyclone cellar, where the family could go in case one of those great whirlwinds arose, mighty enough to crush any building in his path. It was reached by a trap door in the middle of the floor, from which a ladder led down into the small dark hole. When Dorothy stood in the doorway and looked around, she could see nothing but the great gray prairie on every side. Not a tree nor a house broke the broad sweep of flat country that reached the edge of the sky in all directions. The sun had baked the plowed land into a gray mass, with little cracks running through it. Even the grass was not green, for the sun had burned the tops of the long blades until they were the same gray color to be seen everywhere. Once the house had been painted, but the sun blistered the paint, and the rains washed it away, and now the house was as dull and gray as everything else. When Aunt Em came to live there, she was a young, pretty wife. The sun and wind had changed her too. They had taken the sparkle from her eyes and left them a sober gray. They had taken the red from her cheeks and lips, and they were gray also. She was thin and gaunt, and never smiled now. When Dorothy, who was an orphan, first came to her, Aunt Em had been so startled by the child's laughter that she would scream, and press her hand upon her heart whenever Dorothy's merry voice reached her ears. And she still looked at the little girl with wonder that she could find anything to laugh at. Uncle Henry never laughed. He worked hard from morning till night, and did not know what joy was. He was gray also, from his long beard to his rough boots, and he looked stern and solemn, and rarely spoke. It was Toto that made Dorothy laugh, and saved her from growing as gray as her other surroundings. Toto was not gray. He was a little black dog, with long silky hair and small black eyes that twinkled merrily on either side of his funny wee nose. Toto played all day long, and Dorothy played with him, and loved him dearly. Today, however, they were not playing. Uncle Henry sat on the doorstep and looked anxiously at the sky, which was even grayer than usual. Dorothy stood in the door with Toto in her arms, and looked at the sky too. Aunt Em was washing the dishes. From the far north they heard a low wail of the wind, and Uncle Henry and Dorothy could see where the long grass bowed in waves before the coming storm. There now came a sharp whistling in the air from the south, and as they turned their eyes that way they saw the ripples in the grass coming from that direction also. Suddenly Uncle Henry stood up. "There's a cyclone coming, Em," he called to his wife. "I'll go look after the stock." Then he ran toward the sheds where the cows and horses were kept. Aunt Em dropped her work and came to close the door. One glance told her of the danger close at hand. "Quick, Dorothy!" she screamed. "Run for the cellar!" Toto jumped out of Dorothy's arms and hid under the bed, and the girl started to get him. Aunt Em, badly frightened, threw open the trap door in the floor and climbed down the ladder into the small dark hole. Dorothy caught Toto at last, and started to follow her aunt. When she was halfway across the room, there came a great shriek from the wind, and the house shook so hard that she lost her footing and sat down suddenly upon the floor. A strange thing then happened. The house whirled around 2 or 3 times and rose slowly through the air. Dorothy felt as if she was going up in a balloon. The north and south winds met where the house stood, and made it the exact center of the cyclone. In the middle of a cyclone the air is generally still, but the great pressure of the wind on every side of the house raised it up higher and higher until it was at the very top of the cyclone, and there it remained, and was carried miles and miles away as easily as you could carry a feather. It was very dark, and the wind howled horribly around her, but Dorothy found she was riding quite easily. After the first few whirls around, and one other time when the house tipped badly, she felt as if she were being rocked gently, like a baby in a cradle. Toto did not like it. He ran about the room, now here, now there, barking loudly, but Dorothy sat quite still on the floor and waited to see what would happen. Once Toto got too near the open trap door and fell in, and at first the little girl thought she had lost him. But soon she saw one of his ears sticking up through the hole, for the strong pressure of the air was keeping him up so that he could not fall. She crept to the hole, caught Toto by the ear, and dragged him into the room again, afterward closing the trap door so that no more accidents could happen. Hour after hour passed, and slowly Dorothy got over her fright, but she felt quite lonely, and the wind shrieked so loudly all about her that she nearly became deaf. At first she had wondered if she would be dashed to pieces when the house fell again, but as the hours passed and nothing terrible happened, she stopped worrying and resolved to wait calmly and see what the future would bring. At last she crawled over the swaying floor to her bed and lay down upon it, and Toto followed and lay down beside her. In spite of the swaying of the house and the wailing of the wind, Dorothy soon closed her eyes and fell fast asleep. And not only is this particular book of mine, I don't know about the others, but not only does it have a wonderful little story, it comes complete with pictures, as you can see. Little pictures describing the scenes of what's going on. There's usually 1 or 2 per chapter. And I'll leave you with that today. So until next time, remember, this week you should be reading The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. And I'll see you next week.